This is Up Close. I'm Stephen I. Weiss. Religions and beliefs don't exist in a vacuum, and they change over time as influences go back and forth. The yoga tradition is presented popularly as ancient wisdom in classes around America today, but most of what's being taught is less than 100 years old. The woman largely responsible for making your yoga class what it is, and as popular as it is the subject of the nation's senior contributing writer Michelle Goldberg's The Goddess Pose, the audacious life of Indra Devi, the woman who helped bring yoga to the West. And with the mix of religions here in the United States, it can sometimes feel like we're building a distinctly American religion. One way that manifests is with those who belong to multiple religions at once here. Susan Katz Miller discusses that journey in Being Both, Embracing Two Religions in One Interfaith Family. But first, here's Michelle Goldberg talking about how yoga made its way to the West. What is wrong in most people's conception about yoga?
Well, I think that there's a huge gap between kind of how scholars, both religious scholars and also just scholars of the yogic tradition, understand yoga and how it's understood popularly. It's a relatively recent thing that if you say the word yoga, you would picture a series of poses or a series of asanas. And a lot of if you go to a contemporary yoga class, particularly in the States or anywhere in the West, you would get the sense that these poses that we're doing are part of some kind of 3,000-year-old tradition, that people were practicing the same ones on the banks of the Ganges millennia ago. And in fact, yoga as we know it, there is a long tradition of yoga, but yoga is an incredibly labial word. It means any method of concentration or meditation exercise. Where I think yoga became established in Hollywood and, slowly kind of really became a mainstream phenomenon is when the subject of my book, this kind of very intrepid, audacious woman named Indra Devi, a Russian woman born Eugenia Peterson, after having learned yoga with a man named Krishnamacharya, who was kind of part of the ferment that created yoga around the Indian nationalist movement, ended up in Shanghai during World War II, came to Hollywood in 1947, opens the first yoga studio, and soon is teaching Greta Garbo and Gloria Swanson and writing best-selling books. And that's kind of where you start seeing yoga become a real pop culture phenomenon.
For her, yoga was something of a lifelong search where a lot of people, she ended up finding it really in her 40s. Right?
She had this kind of amazing life, right? It touches at least 3 centuries. She was born in 1899. She died in 2002. And, she grew up as an aristocrat in pre-revolutionary Russia, where there was already a big kind of interest in occultism and Eastern spirituality. She discovers a book about yoga in the library of a friend of her mother's when she's a teenager, and it has this tremendous impact on her. She says, I must go to India. And it was this book by Yogi Ramacharaka called 14 Lessons in Yogi Philosophy and Oriental Occultism. And what she didn't realize is that Yogi Ramacharaka was a Chicago self-help writer named William Walter Atkinson, And I think you see a lot of these sorts of both confusions and conflations in the whole history of yoga. People imagining that they're learning some sort of essential Eastern wisdom when they're really kind of getting a message that's been really filtered and transformed through a Western lens.
And what was the yoga of the prior 2,900 years, more directly?
There's yoga philosophy, as laid out in the Yoga Sutras. In the medieval period, there was the development of Hatha Yoga, which were these kind of physical postures and austerities, but they weren't really exercises. They were, kind of part of Tantra. They had occult and sort of sex magic overtones. In the early kind of Indian nationalist period, there was an effort to spread yoga, a modernized version of yoga philosophy to the West. In part because many people legitimately thought it was India's gift to the world. And there was also a strong belief that if the West could be made to appreciate yoga, they would have a harder time supporting colonialism.
And now, Susan Katz Miller discusses Being Both. We know that a lot of people are intermarried in America, whether between religions or between denominations. And we know that that happens a lot in the Jewish community. But our general perception is, and this is the way the vast majority of people who are in interfaith marriages end up, is that they end up fundamentally going one way or the other, and it's a binary. But you're in a community, and you found several communities where there's actually this effort to bind the two religions together. How'd that come about?
Well, first of all, it's a substantial number of people doing this now. The Pew Research big study on the Jewish American landscape that came out in 2013 found about a quarter of all intermarried Jewish parents bringing up their children partly Jewish and partly something else, which in most cases that means they're honoring both religions in the family and giving their kids an interfaith education, which is the way that we think about it. So it's not this marginal, crazy idea to try to do both anymore, even though a lot of religious institutions, a lot of clergy will still urge families to choose one.
One of the messages that comes through very consistently as you speak to these different communities is that if you're going to be involving your children in a discussion about two religions, you almost need to be more prepared on both religions than you would be if you were going to stick with one. For your community and for a bunch of these communities, there's probably some hundreds of families, maybe even a couple thousand families, who are attending services that are interfaith services every single week almost.
If you have one common religion that you share, it can go in many directions. You could become a deeply practicing family with that unified religion. But a lot of people, it's their default religion and they take it for granted, and so they don't necessarily desire to spend that kind of time and effort on it for whatever reason.
It's a fascinating thing to say. We are going to have a discussion about there being clear lines between Christianity and Judaism, and therefore many would say Christians and Jews. And you're saying you children are both, and you're going to be both. What does it mean to embody difference?
I think it's often really hard for people who were born and raised in a single faith context to kind of get this on a gut level, that those of us born into interfaith families grow up feeling that this is normal because it's who we are. And we grow up with our family on both sides being important to us. And so from the very beginning, we're integrating. And it's the parallels, the metaphors are not inappropriate. I don't think very many people would, agree with every single position of one Democrat just because you're a Democrat. No two people share all their beliefs and all their practices, even if they share a label. What we teach our kids in these interfaith programs is that you can't assume what anybody thinks or believes based on their label.
That's all for this week's abbreviated web episode of Up Close. A reminder, you can see the full episode of Up Close on the Jewish channel on cable, or listen to the full audio of Up Close as a podcast, available on iTunes and your favorite podcast player. The Jewish channel is available on cable, Time Warner Cable Channel 1640, IOPLING Channel 505, RCN Channel 268, Cox Cable Channel 1, Bright House Channel 330, Verizon Fios Channel 900, and on Comcast and the on-demand menu on premium channels. For more information, visit tjctv.com.